Hello, everyone. Today we are going to discuss Allegory of the Cave. In particular, focus on limits of perception, the importance of enlightenment and education, and creating value systems, and most importantly for our literature class, application of cave as metaphor. It's important to understand this as we will be applying it for the rest of the semester. It's a hard concept to understand, but I think between the videos, the text, and this explanation video, I think that it should be able to be grasped. Before we begin, though, a little review. Just want to go over. Last time we talked about the background for Plato. We talked about what is an allegory. An allegory is a figure of speech in which abstract ideas and principles are described in terms of characters, figures, and events, like the Narnia series in Christianity, Wizard of Oz and its many interpretations, the Matrix, which is both Christian imagery and also allegory of the cave, which we'll get into a little bit today. And that symbols can be a word, place, or object that means something beyond what it is on the literal level. So like a dove represents peace. The Nazi symbol now represents hate and horror. But just about everything can be interpreted for some deeper meaning. And an allegory is many interconnected symbols. And there are some examples of symbols. Last time we mentioned that Plato's purpose of the allegory was to study the effect of education and the lack of it on our nature. And we talked about that his allegory is related to his theory of forms, that there's a perfect world and that we only see imperfect representations of those perfect forms. And that we should spend our lives trying to get closer to understanding those forms, what he would call the good. So the idea, we all can picture a perfect circle, but every representation of a circle on earth is imperfect. And so that he would say that must mean that somewhere exists that perfect circle. And we should keep trying to strive towards that. We talked about how picturing a bird can get at this, that we all have the concept of bird, but when we try to picture it, it's very different. And we talked about how studying and intense study and looking at things from many different angles can help us understand and get closer to what Plato's world of the forms would be. And that it can get us beyond trusting our perceptions. Then for today, hopefully you've watched the 2 videos and read the text, and that's where we're going to begin today. So one way to understand the allegory of the cave is the limits of our perception. Okay, so part of the critical thinking process is evaluating information the best we possibly can, but always understanding that we can't ever be 100% sure of any information because we may be missing some information, new information may come to light, circumstances may change, and it's the same here that what Plato is saying that in his allegory, what those prisoners who were tied up, the shadows they were viewing, that was their reality. That's what they thought the real world was. There was no question in their mind. There was no, what if we're wrong, right? That's the world they knew. And so Plato's, in one sense, arguing, what if the world we know is only shadow? What if that fish that we're holding in the fish metaphor is actually not a true fish? What if we're falsely perceiving it in some way? And that you could draw that argument all the way out to say, what if our reality is all an illusion, like the Matrix? So there's many different ways to envision Plato's cave. We see two here. And so you have the shadows, you have the shackled prisoners, you have people moving the objects and whispering and talking to each other, and the fire casting those shadows. And ultimately, you have the journey to the real world, or at least what we view as the real world, right? So Plato would argue that the prisoners thought the shadows were real. Then they turn around and they think the objects are the only reality. Then they see the fire and they think, well, that must be the only reality. Then they get outside the cave and they see reflection and they think that must be the only reality. And then finally they see the sun and the world as it is, and they think that's the only reality. But Plato would argue, what if that world is merely another level and we don't know what the next level is? So some ways to think of that, and just in general, and this, when we talk about application of this, the cave as a metaphor, we want to think in general about the idea of mistaking appearance for reality, mistaking what we know to be, have known to be true our entire lives for something false. And that's part of the metaphor that we're going to be applying this semester. And that often, because they think it's their reality, they will swear that is the truth. That is the only truth. What we've known up to this point in our lives, we'll swear is the only truth until new information comes. And couldn't it be the same for us, fooled by our senses into thinking that we perceived reality when in truth it's just a shadow of the world? So if this is the case, if perhaps something we know to be true now is actually false, how can we turn our heads around? How can we find that truth, right? At one level, it's the fish metaphor, through studying, through science, through all our knowledge, all our technology, using everything at our disposal to seek truth, okay? But the other part is recognizing that we're imperfect, that there's always limits, that there's going to be limits to our perception. So some of these limits, for example, language is always going to limit us. There's always what linguists would refer to as slippage between reality and language. For example, different cultures view the color blue differently. There are parts of Eastern Europe where they tested students from the West, from the US, versus these students in Eastern Europe on how many shades of blue they could identify. And in test after test, the students from Eastern Europe would blow us away. It wasn't even close. So they tried to figure out, why is this? Are their eyes better? Is their perception better? And what they found out is no. It's a difference in language. In the West, there's a limited amount of words for different shades of blue. There are more that have been developed over the last few decades, but the average person only knows a handful of names for shades of blue. Where in Eastern Europe, from a very early age, they're taught dozens of different words for each shade of blue. And so when they're taught that from an early age, you can recognize them much easier, much quicker. And so because of a limit in language it actually changes our perception and changes the way we know the world. Another example, now there's been some debate on whether this is actually true or not, but it doesn't matter. I think it gets to the heart of why language is limited. There's the old saying about how if you live in Alaska, you have dozens of words for different kinds of snowflakes. Where if you don't, you might only know a couple, and because of that, that means that they can identify many more snowflakes than the rest of us can. And so it changes the way they perceive the world. Whether that's actually true or not is besides the point. Language changes the way we see things, and it's a limit on our knowledge. Another are limits on reason or logic. Knowledge is highly dependent on culture, gender, power, and hierarchy. So in other words, we measure our logic and reason based on whoever's in power. In our society, one of the reasons why we have problems with equality in say in the workforce, say among genders, is because we've created a social system that values masculinity more in the workforce, and that those norms have to be changed for that equality to change. So for instance, since the 1980s, women have received more degrees, both on the undergraduate and graduate level than men, yet throughout the entire workforce, men still vastly dominate all leadership positions, right? So, and when you look at why this is, what they find is, so if you have a room of 12 board members trying to find the 13th board member, they may say, oh, we're just hiring the best individual for the job. But in reality, say they're for a bank, and what they want is somebody who fits their vision for what the bank does. And their vision is aggressive investing, risk-taking, etc. And so they bring in 30 female candidates and 30 male candidates. And after interviewing all 60 people, they say, there's just no way we can get around this. These three guys are the best three candidates. We have to choose from those three, right? But when you look at it, why it became just those three, it was because they created a value system that privileges the male perspective, right? And so knowledge is highly dependent on our culture, gender, power, and hierarchy. Another example is a famous African-American author. When she was in college English classes, she failed 3 times. Okay, so she fails the course 3 times. After she gets out of college, she goes on to become one of the greatest living authors. And actually, I'm leaving it generic here because I keep forgetting whether it's Toni Morrison or Alice Walker. But one of those famous authors failed college English 3 times. She didn't change the way she wrote, but the value system changed. That college English teacher was expecting certain structures from her that she was refusing to give. And then when she got out of college, all of a sudden the value system changed, that she could be appreciated for different values, right? Because of who holds power in the college system, her values were not valued, and so she was failed. That's one of the reasons why I am an English professor, but I actually am against grading for grammatical errors. Often grammar is used as a tool to weed out different cultures, different classes. There's a reason why it's called the King's or Queen's English, right? So a limit on the way we perceive the world is that our reason and logic is very dependent, and this can make us blind to people like that author who have a lot to give us, or that candidate who didn't make those top 3, who could really help the company, but we've developed these value systems. Another is emotion. Emotion is highly dependent on our sensory perception. For instance, there's been court cases where they find that if there's a pleasant odor in the courtroom, the jurors actually give a harsher sentence. And if there's a foul odor, they give a lighter sentence. And that actually seems the opposite of what you'd expect. But when there's a pleasant odor, they find jurors want to maintain that pleasant nature, right? So they punish harshly to get rid of anything that would defile that odor. And it's at the subconscious level. It's not something we think about. It's on the subconscious level. So that's another limit. Another limit to the way we see the world are our senses. Our senses cannot be trusted. For instance, the obvious ones would be like something like color blindness, or for instance, I have an allergy to cilantro, the herb, and the allergy actually makes it taste like soap. So I would anytime I'd go to especially a Mexican restaurant, I would always complain, man, what is with this place? They don't like rinse off their dishes. It just tastes so soapy. And for years, my friends would just politely look at me and nod, and nobody said a word. And then finally, I ran into someone who said, no, it's not that. It's that you have this allergy. And so for years, my perception of that experience of eating at those restaurants was changed because my sense perception was off, right? Same thing you can think about with how people sometimes have Halloween parties and you close your eyes and you feel skinned grapes and they feel like eyeballs, right? Our senses are easily fooled. And so that's something we should, that is a version of shadows that we should be careful of. Also, our perception is very limited. We only see, I'm not going to get into the science here, but we only see a very limited part of the spectrum. So there's a lot going on in our world that we just have no knowledge of on a daily basis. Also, we're easily fooled. I'm not sure how this image appears on your screen, but on mine, it looks like it's moving, and it's actually not. If you place your finger over any one area, you'll notice it stops moving. But what that's actually doing is it's one of those optical illusions where it's not moving at all. It's the way our eyes perceive it. So we are easily fooled. Also, our culture limits the way we know the world. So most people know this illusion now, right? That these two lines are actually equal length, but the arrows make us view them differently, as you can see there. But let's look at where this experiment or example came from, and it helps us understand how culture can limit the way we view the world. So first, we are weird. What the acronym WEIRD stands for is Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic Societies, right? We're a minority in the world. Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic Societies are the minority. Yet, most of our psychological studies, most of our biological studies, most of the research that we do are based in those societies, and so they change the results. It changed the way the world's perceived. So one example, adults living in Evanston, Illinois perceived line B to be on average 20% longer than line A, while students at nearby Northwestern University and white adults in South Africa similarly believed that line B was between 13 and 15% longer. Then the researchers journeyed farther afield, testing people from several African tribes. Bushmen from southern Africa failed to show the illusion at all, perceiving the lines as almost identical. Small samples of Suku tribespeople from northern Angola and Bedi tribespeople from the Ivory Coast also failed to show the illusion. There's no biological differences, so the answer to why they were originally able to do so much better at this test than us is cultural. In contrast to most Western societies, the Bushmen, the Suku, and Bedi lived in worlds with very few straight lines. Their houses, often made of thatch, were either rounded or devoid of the hard lines that dominate Western interiors, and they spent most of their time gazing at natural scenes. Why should this have mattered? Over years and years, people who live in hard geometric interiors become used to judging the size of objects based on the rules of three-dimensional perspective, for example. So because of this, because we view the world through this, it changes the way we see the world in other ways. We know that in this image, the lines are very different, but we know this is trying to represent the lines as being the same. Then, of course, there's the Matrix, or some of you may know Elon Musk has recently created some news by saying this. One of our limits or one of our failures of perception would be, what if we're actually just living in a simulation or a dream? Or some sort of computer or something. If you ever saw the Matrix movies, that was one of the main premises of it, was that the world that we knew was not real and that we're all living in some sort of simulation. You see this often in sci-fi. And even if you say, that's ridiculous, often you could just step back and say, would we really know if we were? We probably wouldn't know. We'd probably just go on living our lives, kind of like the Truman Show with Jim Carrey, if you ever saw that. But there's actually been some mathematicians and scientists and Elon Musk who have argued that actually the odds are very, very high that this is the case, right? So all of that basically tells us what we know about the world. We should question, we should wonder, we should investigate, we should pursue truth, right? Another way to look at this is through a parable. So similar to the allegory of the cave, this is allegorical. It's built on symbols, and it's designed to make us question reality versus truth. Once upon a time, there lived 6 blind men in a village. One day, the villagers told them, "Hey, there's an elephant in the village today." They had no idea what an elephant is. They decided, even though we would not be able to see it, let us go and feel it anyway. All of them went where the elephant was. Every one of them touched the elephant. "Hey, the elephant's a pillar," said the first man who touched his leg. "Oh no, it's like a rope," said the second man who touched the tail. "Oh no, it's like a thick branch of a tree," said the third man who touched the trunk of the elephant. "It's like a big hand fan," said the fourth. "It's like a huge wall," said the fifth who touched the belly. "It's like a solid pipe," said the sixth man who touched the tusk. They began to argue about the elephant, and every one of them insisted that he was right. It looked like they were getting agitated. A wise man was passing by this, and he saw it. He stopped and asked them, "What's the matter?" They said, "We cannot agree to what the elephant is like." Each one of them told him what the elephant was like. The wise man calmly explained to them, all of you are right. The reason why every one of you is telling you it differently is because each one of you touched a different part of the elephant. So actually the elephant has all those features that you all said. Oh, there was no more fight. They felt happy that they were all right. The moral of the story is that there may be some truth to what someone says. Sometimes we can see the truth and sometimes not, because they may have a different perspective that we don't see or agree with. So rather than arguing like the blind man, we should say, maybe you have your reasons. This way we don't get into arguments. In Jainism, it is explained that truth can be stated in 7 different ways. So you can see how broad our religion is. It teaches us to be tolerant towards others for their viewpoints. This allows us to live in harmony with other people or different thinking. So you can think of that in world affairs. Okay, this idea that we have so many different cultures that obviously we're going to see the world differently. And this creates a problem with perception. So, for example, we often hear about how the Iranian leader, if you watch any news on international affairs, the Iranian leader screams, "Death to America, death to America," right? And all the news stations run with it, and it gets high ratings because it scares people, right? And when you're scared, you watch to find out more. But in reality, it's a failure of translation. The way that the phrase that the Iranian leader's using should be interpreted is death to American policies, right? Death to American imperialism. Now, they say, well, that's still not a good thing. It's not, but it's a lot different than death to America, right? So another example is right now there's been tensions with the leader of North Korea. And a lot of people in the U.S. say, well, this guy's crazy. You know, of course we should fear him. And of course we should, be aggressive towards him. If you study international culture and you look at to why he's acting the way he is, and his father and grandfather did as well, Kim Jong-un is his name, what you have is 60 years ago, there had been a series of invasions in North Korea. And so over and over again, their people were just devastated by foreign powers. And so 60 years ago, they instituted a policy called Juk-chi. And Juk-chi was an idea, a very simple idea. Say you're in a classroom and you're the kid that's always picked on, right? You're getting bullied, you're getting picked on, it's happening over and over again. Well, all of a sudden, you decide one day, I'm just going to act as crazy as possible. I'm going to hit my head into the wall. I'm going to run in circles, talk to myself. I'm going to just act as crazy as possible. And maybe people will be so freaked out they leave me alone, right? Well, that's basically North Korea's foreign policy, is act as crazy as possible and maybe people will leave us alone. And for 60 years, they haven't been invaded. And so when you hear all the fear-mongering on TV, you need to understand that policy. It can help you understand, just like the blind men and the elephant, what's really going on, that there's something else underneath. And that's how we should look at the world in every regard. We should look at it critically. We should look at it broadly. We should try to find out more and seek truth. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to focus on today, that Plato's allegory says that we should distinguish appearance from reality, that our senses are untrustworthy, our knowledge is highly dependent on many different factors, and that we can often be wrong. Okay. Now, the next part that we want to look at is explaining enlightenment. the allegory as a metaphor for education. So some of the main points he would be saying here is that education should focus on moving from shadows to the real, trying to enlighten us. Kind of is right in the word enlighten. Education can often involve pain or confusion. So if you find out something in a class that goes against all your cultural norms, all your cultural traditions, all your cultural values, but you look at it and you're like, wow, there's a lot of truth to that. But everything I've ever known, everyone I've ever known says this opposite thing. Well, that can be painful. That can be confusing. And if you were to accept that fact, when you go back to your life, it may make you an outcast, right? I find this all the time with something called code switching, right? When you become a professor, over time, your language changes. You start to remove some of your colloquialism, some of your dialect. You start to use larger words and broaden your vocabulary. And so I remember listening to a friend of mine who's a professor who would talk about when he went home, he would completely shift his language. And all of a sudden he would start speaking Pittsburghese, which you don't hear in his teaching voice, right? All of a sudden he would be talking in smaller words and similar. And the reason he would do that code shifting, and I do that as well when I go home I'm originally from Buffalo. I do a lot of that as well, is because if you don't do the code switching, you stand out. You might be viewed as pretentious. You might be viewed as, oh, he's different. He thinks he's above us now, right? So it can make you an outcast. It's often a one-way trip. So if you've escaped the matrix and you see the world for what it is, you can't get rid of that. You can't go back and live in the matrix and feel totally fulfilled. Or the Truman Show, if you ever saw that, you can't just stay in the show. You need to find out what reality really is. Another example of this would be just things we're taught by our families, things we're taught by our local culture, things we're taught many different regards in our lives. I'm 38 years old, and I'm still finding out things that I just say to myself, I can't believe I've thought that for 38 years, and now I find out it's just not true, right? So one example for me was growing up, my family, my mom was kind of a parent of our household since she was like 13. She would cook and do the bills and all that stuff. And so she was very responsible, but she never really got taught a lot of things about like how to eat healthy, stuff like that. And so when I was growing up, she passed along what she knew, what was full of myths and errors and all that. And it wasn't until my 30s that all of a sudden I started to realize, oh, that thing my mom said was healthy, not really, right? And so you can see this happens to us all the time in our life. It can make you a nerd, an outcast. It can make you seem clumsy, mentally clumsy, or out of touch, right? And Plato argues that true enlightenment, true seeing beyond the shadows, cannot be taught. You must see it for yourself. Somebody can guide you. Somebody can ask you questions and push you along the way, but you must see it for yourself. Okay, and then 3, Plato's Allegory of the Cave also has us question our value systems. Okay, so in the cave, social status among the prisoners was determined how well and fast they could identify shadows. In other words, social status was based on an illusion. Okay? So I want you to think for a moment about how that corresponds with our society. How is social status determined in our society? How do we determine who should be praised, who should be looked up to, who should be valued more? I'll say a few, but I'm sure there's plenty that you could add to this as well. So, for instance, we view who makes the most money often as the most important people. So I often use this example. I once dated a girl whose father was a millionaire, and he was trying to get me to come work for him. And his final pitch to me on why I should come work for him was, he said, "Your dad breaks his back at a factory and barely can pay his bills." He goes, "Well, every time I go take a dump, I make more than your father does in a year." Right? And so in that, you could see our society values what this millionaire does more than what my father does. Right? And when in reality, that's a value system that you can either accept or reject, right? And so it took me some time in my life to realize, oh no, that value system's wrong. I value what my dad does more, right? My dad works hard to put food on my table. When I was growing up, he worked at a meat packing plant, and so he was working hard to put food on other people's tables. Well, that's incredibly valuable, right? But our society says, no, that's not as valuable as others, right? So that's one way. Another is things like sports or entertainment or social networking. So because one person can throw a ball better than another person, we're going to give them $20 million, right? We'll give the person who owns or goes on TV and advertises for a sneaker company, we'll give them 20 million, and the people who work in the factories making the sneaker, barely a living wage, right? So in our society, we have to determine what value systems are real, are true, are accurate, a good reflection of what we should value, and what is real. For me, the example I came to, as I said, was I said, I'm going to reject the world's value system. I'm going to value my father more, right? And so we should question any value system we have. The value system that says a teenager should be mocked because their clothes are out of date. Well, that seems like a problematic value system, but it's one we all accept. Almost all of us accept at some points in our life, right? Okay. So what's most important for us, the thing I want you to understand the most for the rest of the semester about Plato and how we're going to use the allegory of the cave for the rest of the term, is how the allegory can be applied. Because when we look at stories, I want you to think of this allegory. Okay, it's the framework from which we're going to learn this semester. So think for a moment on these topics here or anything else you can think of. How could the allegory be applied to love, to family, education, your major profession, the world, other cultures, science, medicine, media, religion, appearances, act? And we've also we've hit on a number of these already, okay? But I want to continue to problematize them, right? Continue to look at them more. So for education, for instance, okay, how we can apply the allegory to education. So our education system, this is to give one example of applying the allegory of the cave metaphor. So our education system, our college system, is built on the first Plato's model of the university, and it was later refined to the German model of the university in the about 300 years ago. So this system was built on what's called the banking model of education. So basically, I go throughout my education years receiving knowledge from educators, from professors, from teachers, and they deposit all of their knowledge into me. Throughout my educational career, they deposit knowledge, and then I give the knowledge back in the form of tests, quizzes, etc. Then I become a teacher, I deposit my knowledge into you, and you give that knowledge back in papers and quizzes and etc. Okay. The problem with this is the world's changed a lot in 300 years, right? And most of our university fails to recognize that. We're still living in the cave and saying how much you can memorize is what's most important. And that's just not true anymore. Matter of fact, there's been research that has shown that since the creation of the internet, brain patterns have drastically changed to de-emphasize memorization, to show that process is much more important than memorization, especially for people born since the internet. And that how to find and acquire information is more important than retaining and memorizing. But our university hasn't, most universities have not adjusted to that change, right? That's a limitation of the cave. We're in the cave. We think that by you memorizing information, that's the best way that we can evaluate how well you'll do in the world. Well, that's a cave. That's a cultural cave that's limiting what we could truly do. For example, there was a professor at Carnegie Mellon who, after many, many years of study, he was had a PhD in neuroscience. And what he decided was our school system, the way it's set up with subjects, completely ineffective, inefficient, and perhaps destructive, right? And what he said is our brain learns in this amount of ways, and I forget how many, is either 5 or 7. That's how we learn information, is through these 5 or 7 processes. And so what he said is our entire system needs to be reworked and organized by those 5 or 7 processes. And he said, what you do is, instead of having all different subjects, what you do is this year, all freshmen have a project. And in order to achieve that project, you'll have to consult with professors, you'll have to consult with textbooks, you'll have to consult with the internet and databases and all that. But your main goal for the year is that project. And so one year, it was creating a virtual reality system to help soldiers with PTSD. The next year, it was designing a water system for an area in Africa that was facing severe drought, right? And so what the students would do is, over the course of 1 year, they would have to teach themselves, say with the virtual reality, they'd have to teach themselves computer science, mathematics, language, and everything you can imagine, everything you'd have to learn in college, but they would do it on their own in consultation in order to achieve this product or this project. And what they found was students did a lot better in that type of learning. They would learn vastly more in that year than they would have in the subject-based model. So this professor from Carnegie Mellon says, I want to work on instituting this. And Carnegie Mellon says, no, that's not going to happen, right? Because in their cultural cave, this is the person coming back from the outside world and trying to explain something to them. And they're saying, no, that doesn't fit what we know of the world, right? And so what happened was, for years, it stalled. And then finally, Carnegie Mellon said, you know what, we're making a branch campus out in California. You want to lead that branch campus, and you can do it in your way. And so he did, and it's been a great project so far. So other applications of the cave. So we could view our culture as a cave, right? We see the world through our lens. An example of this is our healthcare system. If you ask most Americans, they'll say we have the best healthcare system in the world. But if you actually go look at statistics, we're usually between 30th and 50th in the world. And we pay on average about 3 times as much. But because we view it through our cultural lens, we have a hard time changing that system. Other example is it's a silly one, but it's accurate. So in Western culture, we view going to the bathroom on a toilet as the only advanced thing a culture would do, right? That it's obviously much more sanitary and much better. When over half of the world does not use the Western version of a toilet, they often use squatty potties, they're called, or through a hole in the floor, right? And Americans would say, "Oh, how barbaric! How awful! How..." Well, the truth of it is, it's actually a lot healthier to use the non-Western way of going to the bathroom than it is our own. But because of it's a lot better for your digestive system. It prevents things, problems like IBS, hemorrhoids, all of the digestive issues you could imagine. But because of our American culture and the cave we live in, we refuse to see that. Another example would be gender as a cave. So men in the U.S. live about 5 years less than women on average. And while there's a number of factors to that, one of the main factors is that men do not go to the doctor as often as women do. Men refuse to go on average, for their checkups and see the doctor a lot less than women do. And because of that, it shaves years off our lives. But because our gender acts as a cave, most men do not see that or do not understand that. The same could be said of how men are often enculturated towards violent activities, from cowboys and Indians to robbers to football to the army to military. We're taught from we're little that men should accept violence more readily. That again shortens our lifespan a bit. Also, the idea of gender as a binary, male, female. You say, oh, well, it absolutely is a binary. Well, there have been many cultures throughout history who have viewed gender as more of a scale, have viewed it as many genders, some 3, some 4, some many. And for most of our history, we've said, nope, it's just this binary, right? Well, over the last few decades, scientists in the U.S. have started coming around and saying, actually, there are a lot of gradations. There are a lot of exceptions to this. But because our cultural cave says, no, it's a binary, we're really struggling as a culture to get out of, to understand the true complexity of gender, right? Media as a cave, I talked about that with Iran and China. And history as a cave. So the idea, history goes to the victor, right? Those who win often write the history, often burn down the records of those who were lost. Example of this is throughout a lot of uncovered history or recovered history. There have been many, many, many matriarchal societies led by women. But often after they were conquered at some point, a lot of that history was written over. And so to this day, when you study history, you study very little about matriarchal societies. So as we study this semester, as we read stories, I want you to think about this. What cave could this story represent? What cave could this help us see beyond? Or what would we have to do to see beyond this cave, whether it's our cultural cave, our gender cave, our limitations in many different ways. And as we study, I want to keep coming back to this and using it as a perspective for viewing our stories this semester. At this point, you should go do the quiz on this video and continue on to I Am a Cat by Natsumi Soseki. Thanks.